So I've been learning Mandarin Chinese on and off for about 6 years now. I say on and off because sometimes I fall into these periods where I lose motivation and I kind of slow down learning it. But I've been kind of learning it on and off for about 6 years now, right? And I've kind of reached a level where maybe lower intermediate, mid intermediate, where I can right now I'm reading a comic called One Piece. You've probably heard of it. It's like a Japanese manga. I'm reading that in Chinese. So that's about my ability. And in this video, I'm going to argue why I think that Chinese is by far the hardest language I've ever learned, right? So I've learned about 5 languages now. The languages I've learned have all been European, right? So Russian, Spanish, Italian, and I think Chinese is by far the hardest out of all those. Now, I'm not claiming that Chinese is the hardest language in the world, right? Like there are like 6,000 languages in the world or so. I'm not saying it's the hardest in the world, but I'm saying for English speakers, Chinese is going to be one of the hardest languages they could ever learn, right? And it's a big debate, right? Like whether Chinese is actually really easy or really hard. Some people argue that Chinese is super easy because it doesn't have grammar. Other people argue that it's super, super difficult and it's really hard to learn. So in this video, I'm going to bring up some points and argue why I think it's super hard. So the first thing I can mention is Chinese has basically 0 cognates. So a cognate is a word that is similar in one language as it is to another language. So in this example, English. So for example, the Spanish word for communication is comunicación. The Spanish word for metal is metal. So these are cognates. And about 60% of Spanish is similar to English. So what that means is that you're basically getting 60% of Spanish for free when you learn it. But here's the thing, Chinese has basically 0 cognates, 0 words that are similar to their English counterpart. I think in modern day usage, Chinese has about 20 cognates, right? Like salad is shala, and sofa is shafa, and chocolate is 巧克力, right? So there are a couple cognates, but not many. There are like 20 that are commonly used. And this means you basically have to learn every single word from scratch. Like most languages, if they're gonna adopt a new word into their language, they often take the English counterpart. Take, for example, the word computer. 100 years ago, computers were invented, right? And suddenly every language needed a word for computer. Most of the languages just took the English word for computer and modified it a bit. For example, the Spanish word for computer is computadora, right? So they just took the word for computer and modified it a little bit. But Chinese doesn't do that. Because of their writing system, what Chinese does is they basically invent a whole ass new word, right? So the Chinese word for computer is 电脑, which basically means electrical brain. So they basically took the English word for computer and created a whole new word. So that's the first reason why Chinese is so difficult, because it's got basically 0 cognates, 0 words. You have to learn every single word from scratch. And kind of related to that, point number 2 why Chinese is so hard is it has so few sounds. So what do I mean by that? So in English, I learned that English has 18,000 sounds. So for example, the word library has 3 sounds. Li, bre, ri. Cat is a sound. Dog is a sound. Metal, 2 sounds. So English has about 18,000 sounds. Chinese has about 400, I think 400, 600 sounds. That's it. 400 compared to 18,000. So what this means is that Chinese is basically recycling 400 different sounds and combining them in different ways to make all their words. So what this means is that when you're listening to Chinese, everything sounds so familiar because there are so few sounds that it's very difficult to distinguish different words. Like when I'm listening, when I hear a new word in Chinese, often I'll be like, okay, that word kind of sounds familiar because it'll just be these same sounds recycled, right? And so most Chinese sounds actually sound very similar. Like there's not many sounds that exist in the language. It's like qi, xi, ji, ri, chi, shi. You know, there are not many different sounds in Chinese. So that's reason number 2 that makes it so difficult. When you're listening to Chinese, it's very hard to recognize when a new word ends and a new word begins. It's very hard to like store all these words in your memory because they all sound the same. Like I think there's a poem in Chinese that's like 10 lines long. It's a tongue twister, but it's like 10 lines long and it just uses the sound shi over and over in different tones, in different ways, and it's a full, complete poem. It's like sure, 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 sure. It's like that's what makes Chinese so difficult, because there are so few sounds. Okay, so that's reason number 2. Reason number 3 why Chinese is so difficult. This one's going to be kind of, I wouldn't say controversial. Some people disagree with this, but the grammar is super complicated. Now, here's the argument that people make about why Chinese is easy to learn. People argue that Chinese does not have grammar, and this is completely wrong. Chinese just does not have the grammar that that European languages have, right? So what makes European languages hard is that they have cases on their nouns, they have tenses on their verbs, they have feminine and masculine on their adjectives and their nouns and everything. Chinese doesn't have all these complicated grammar things, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have grammar. Chinese has complicated grammar in other ways. Like, there are so many tiny particles that are located everywhere in Chinese grammar, and that's what makes it so difficult. That's one reason. There are so many, basically, you have to essentially learn a whole new phrase for individual scenarios in Chinese. It's really hard to explain, but the grammar is insanely complicated. Saying that Chinese is easy because it doesn't have grammar is like saying that soccer is easy because you don't have to use your hands, right? It's like saying, oh, you can beat Messi really easily because you don't have to use your hands. Like, it has grammar, it just doesn't have the grammar that we have, that we find difficult. So that's point number 3. Point number 4, in my opinion, this is probably one of the biggest ones, tones. So essentially, every single syllable in Chinese has a tone attached to it. You could go ma, 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 ma. It's got 4 tones, right? So essentially, on top of every single syllable in the language, you have to memorize a whole ass new dimension to it, right? So essentially, when you're speaking the language, you kind of also have to sing it. Not exactly, but why this is so difficult is our ears are not trained to listen to these changes in tones, right? So when you're listening to a text, often you don't know if you're listening to one word or another word because you're not recognizing the tones. And it takes a long time for your ears to become familiar with those tones and recognize them. And also makes it difficult to learn words because you also have to learn the tones attached to the words. And another thing on this is tones don't just exist on their own. When syllables with different tones are next to each other, the tones will affect each other. So actually, it's not that each individual syllable has a tone, it's more like the entire sentence has this kind of flow, these kind of tones that go on top of it. And another reason why tones make learning Chinese so difficult, this is just a personal thing, but I really like to learn languages through music. Like, I like to listen to music, memorize the music, and learn words and learn the pronunciation that way, right? But the thing is, because Chinese has tones, and tones are essentially melodies, when you sing in Chinese, the tones disappear. So when you're actually listening to a Chinese song, you're not actually listening to any tones, you're not actually learning the tones. So essentially, you're taking away a lot of your learning ability when you're learning Chinese through music. This is just a personal thing because I really like to use music to learn languages. But that's the 3rd point, or 4th point. The next point I'll mention is characters. Often people will say characters are so difficult in Chinese, right? Like, what makes Chinese so hard is that you have to memorize thousands of characters, and it's completely true. You need to know about 3,000, 4,000 characters to be reasonably proficient. I think I know about probably 2,000 characters, right? And what makes characters, okay, here's what I think. Personally, I don't think characters are what make Chinese difficult. Because when you learn, the reason characters are so difficult is because there's so many of them. You have to learn 4,000 characters. But that's basically all you're doing. You're just memorizing a bunch of symbols. So it's not that it's hard, it's just that it takes a long time. Like, in most languages, it takes you maybe an hour to learn the writing system. Like, Russian has a different writing system, but it only takes like an hour, 2 hours to learn it, a couple hours to get used to it. But with Chinese, I've learned 2,000 characters. It took me hundreds of hours. You have to basically use an additional couple hundred hours, couple thousand hours to learn something that most languages don't even have. The Chinese writing system is so complicated, it just takes a long time. That's what makes it so hard. So I think it's not that characters are hard, it just takes a long time. But the biggest problem with characters is when you can't read a word. So when you're seeing a word and you don't know the characters, you straight up cannot read the word, right? So if you don't know a character, you are straight up illiterate. In Spanish or any other language, if you don't know the word, you can still read it, you can still copy it, you can still pronounce it. But in Chinese, if you don't know the character, it may as well be gibberish, right? So that's what makes it so difficult, because you can't just like read a text in the wild and easily transcribe the words, easily search up the words. It basically puts a whole nother level of resistance to reading the language, to learning the language. So that's one of the reasons characters make Chinese so difficult. And what other point was I going to mention here? You know, there are a bunch of other difficulties too. For example, with culture. Because the culture is so different, it's so much less accessible for English speakers. It's so foreign that, although you could see this as a good thing, I'm not saying this is a bad thing, right? Having such a different culture makes it interesting to explore it, interesting to become accustomed to it, to learn about it. But because it's so different, you've got a bunch of these like cultural nuances that you have to learn when you learn Chinese. For example, Chinese people will drop these things, will drop idioms, 4-character idioms, randomly into their speech. They will just randomly quote these idioms that they learned in school. It's a common thing. Most Chinese people will know thousands of these idioms. It's kind of like, imagine if English speakers were speaking to each other and they would just casually quote Shakespeare every now and then, right? Like every few minutes they would casually quote Shakespeare. That's basically what they do in Chinese. So there are these like tiny nuanced things that make learning Chinese so difficult, right? But here's the thing. Okay, actually the final thing I'll mention that makes learning Chinese so hard is it's not a very popular language to learn. So because of that, there's not many resources to actually learn the language. Like, it's my personal opinion, but I don't think the media and the music in Chinese is that amazing. Like, I do like to listen to music in Chinese, I do like to watch some TV shows, but they're not like mind-blowingly amazing. Like Latin American music, Korean music is like really good. Like their media, their culture is really, really like popular or whatever. But Chinese, it's much less popular. And because it's less of a popular language to learn, there's also fewer resources for learners. So often one of the things that make a language easy to learn is if there are a bunch of resources. So actually in learning Chinese, it's very difficult for me to find a show I enjoy, music I enjoy, resources that I enjoy using to learn the language. So that's another level of difficulty on top of learning the language. Okay, and the final thing I'll mention is because it's so hard, it is so rewarding. If you can like recognize a Chinese sentence versus like a Spanish sentence, it is so much more rewarding because it's hard. Like when you learn hard things, they are just much more rewarding. Essentially like, so Spanish, European languages, the thing about them is if you go back far enough in history, English and these European languages, they were the same language. If you go back about 6,000 years, English and Spanish and Russian and even Hindi and Persian, they were all the same root language, Proto-Indo-European. So essentially those languages are essentially all distantly related to each other. So they're essentially dialects of each other. Technically Spanish is a dialect of English, but Chinese is not at all related to English. Well, it hasn't been proven, but there's zero proven relation between Chinese and English. So when you're learning Chinese, you are essentially learning a foreign language. You are essentially learning this alien way of communicating that is completely different. It's a completely new way of approaching concepts in the world. Because a grammar pattern is a way of explaining a concept in the world. So Chinese is just a completely different way of representing all the concepts in the world, all the words in the world. So that's why I find it super interesting to learn. And I personally I just love learning Chinese. I love learning about the culture. I love learning about the media. I love speaking to Chinese people. So again, like I think don't let the difficulty of a language determine if you're going to learn it. Let the interest in the language determine if you're going to learn it. If you love Japanese anime, learn Japanese. Don't just avoid it because it's hard. Or if you love like Latin American culture, learn Spanish. Follow your interests when it comes to learning languages. Don't be afraid if a language is hard. Yes, Chinese is hard. Yes, it can be demotivating because progress is slower, but it's still super rewarding because I enjoy the progress. I enjoy hustling and playing with the language. So let that guide you. Let that be what helps you decide to learn a language. So hopefully this video helped you. See you later.